With a little help from the government, how UK media operates. Nikolai Gorshkov. British media may not be as free and independent as they claim to be, newly declassified UK government files show. The files were released today by the National Archives in London. During a tit-for-tat expulsions row between London and Moscow in May 1989, UK politicians were particularly incensed by the expulsion of 3 British journalists working in Russia. The fact that it was a mere response to the expulsion of 3 Soviet journalists from London did not inconvenience them. During a debate in the Commons, most MPs insisted there was no moral equivalence between the work of British journalists, who were truly independent of the government, and their Soviet numbers who, the MPs claimed, were under the Kremlin's thumb. While the MPs were celebrating the independence of British media from the government was busy doing the BBC's bidding in Eastern Europe, helping the otherwise independent broadcaster get preferential treatment to secure on-air licenses against local competition. Copyright photo, National Archives, London. BBC letter to UK government regarding Hungary rebroadcasting deal. In 1990, the BBC applied to the Hungarian authorities for permission to rebroadcast BBC Hungarian and World Service English on FM in Budapest and 5 regional centres. The project was raised by Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher during her visit to Hungary and was endorsed both privately and at a press conference with the Hungarian Prime Minister Antal. But in 1992 the project hit the rocks. Media bill to regulate allocation of frequencies got stuck in the Hungarian parliament, and the BBC became worried that, in the absence of law, low-level officials would take matters into their own hands and would sideline the BBC in the allocation struggle. The broadcaster came up with an easy explanation: most of those officials were ex-communists won over by generous lobbyists. Help from above. The corporation scrambled to enlist the ultimate lobbyist, the Prime Minister, writing to John Major's office, whether the media bill is passed or not, intervention at a senior level is needed to secure the BBC's rebroadcasting deal. The BBC would undoubtedly stand a much stronger chance if Her Majesty's government were to express its concern, to support its plea for help from the government. The BBC reminded John Major that his predecessor Margaret Thatcher had successfully promoted a similar rebroadcasting deal in Czechoslovakia in her talks with President Havel. With the Prime Minister's help, we could achieve the same success in Hungary, the BBC wrote to Major's private secretary Stephen Wall. The government obliged. In a meeting with Hungarian PM Antal in October 1992, John Major read from the BBC brief, adding that he was very keen for the BBC to be able to operate this service. In fairness to the BBC, the corporation was not the only media outlet seeking favours from the British government. About the same time as Margaret Thatcher was busy lobbying the BBC's interests in Hungary and Czechoslovakia, her office was approached by the Sunday Telegraph asking if the Prime Minister could feed in to Gorbachev the paper's request for an interview. To make the bid irresistible, the Sunday Telegraph assured Mrs. Thatcher that the assistant editor who would interview Gorbachev was a strong supporter of the Prime Minister. The paper thought this point might carry some weight with Gorbachev's staff. Copyright photo, National Archives, London. Letter from Thatcher aide Powell to British ambassador in Moscow asking to help. Sunday Telegraph read, so many British journalists were besieging the Prime Minister's office seeking help to get access to Gorbachev, that at one point her private secretary Charles Powell had to apologise to British ambassador in Moscow Sir Roderick Braithwaite, whose job it was to feed in their requests to the Kremlin. You must be fed up with getting letters from me about individual journalists or television presenters. With some select media outlets, Powell took a more hands-on approach. A BBC request for an interview with Gorbachev was sent right to the top. As Powell wrote back to Jonathan Dimbleby, who sought his help in submitting an interview bid to the Soviet president, I knew that all was well when I looked across the desk during our meeting with Mr. Gorbachev and saw that Chernayev, Gorbachev's aide and Powell's opposite number, Inc., had drawn up a little list of points for Gorbachev's decision, of which no. 5 was BBC. It had a tick against it in red ink. Copyright photo, National Archives, London. Powell letter to Dimbleby about successful lobbying of their request. It was a great cue to get the first interview, Mrs. Thatcher's private secretary wrote, but whose coup it was, the journalists or the government's? Copyright photo, National Archives, London. Dimbobi letter to Powell thanking for help with Gorbachev. The views and opinions expressed by the contributor do not necessarily reflect those of Sputnik.